Our next topic is beetles that affect soybeans. Sounds like fun, Darren.
Well, it wouldn't be summer if we didn't have some insects trying to eat our crops. And when you get late season in soybeans especially, once those pods are forming and you've got those soybeans just hanging there, if an insect comes along that clips those pods off or that chews off all the leaves so the plant can't gather energy to fill those pods, it's a big, big problem. And you think, man, I've put all this effort into raising a great crop and now a little bug is going to come along at the end of the year and take it all away from me? I don't think so.
Okay, the two beetles that we want to talk about today are Japanese beetles and bean leaf beetles. Let's start with the bean leaf beetles. Those are easier to control, and we've had more of them in the upper Midwest for more years. Well, anyway, with the bean leaf beetle, it's very easy to identify because all you're looking for is a black triangle right behind the head on its back. The other thing with bean leaf beetles, we can have multiple generations per year. In our part of the world, we'll typically have 2 generations per year, and they'll actually overwinter as adults. So you'll see last year's final adult stage right away early in the spring. Then they'll lay eggs and die, and then you've got more of them coming back later in the year, and it might happen another time again to you as well.
Well, here's the thing. Earlier this year in June, we had some guys looking at their soybean roots saying, wait a minute, I think I have corn rootworms feeding on my soybean roots.
Yep.
And what it actually was is the larvae stage of bean leaf beetles. Those adult beetles early in the season had laid eggs, and then they were little worms in the soil that fed on the soybean roots, and then they emerged later as adults again, and here they are trying to clip off our pods.
Okay, so the most dangerous time for bean leaf beetles is when they can clip pods, all right? When you talk about early season bean leaf beetle problems, that's not a big deal in terms of the leaf feeding they do. In other words, they could defoliate half your plants or take half the leaves off your plants. It really wouldn't affect yield much unless they inject disease.
Yes, and that's the thing with bean leaf beetles. They have been known to be a vector for certain diseases. So you have to be careful if you've got bean leaf beetles out there. I don't really look at the defoliation thresholds anymore. I don't say, well, I need 25% defoliation before it justifies treatment. I really don't pay attention to that because we know we have some of those diseases in the upper Midwest. I'm concerned about that. If there's a bug feeding on my crop, I want it dead.
Yeah, like bean pod mottle virus. Typically, the bean leaf beetle can carry a number of different diseases, especially that bean pod mottle virus, and that will discolor, disfigure your soybean seed at the end of the season and hurt yield that way. So it's not just the leaf damage they do, it's not just the pod clipping that they can do, it's also that disease that they can inject into your plant.
All right, well, that's enough about bean leaf beetles. Let's talk about Japanese beetles, because this is one that seems to be moving further west.
Well, that's what they keep telling us is, you got to watch out. There's going to be Japanese beetles all over the place.
There's a few that are getting into South Dakota now, so that gets right in our backyard and it gets us a little bit concerned about them. But Japanese beetles are a whole different animal. They are big and they look a lot different than bean leaf beetles. They typically have a metallic green color to them and kind of a bronze colored wing and white tufts of hair along the abdomen. And Japanese beetles are big and big eaters too.
Yep, they're big not only when they reach that adult beetle stage, but they're big in the larvae stage, which is an annual grub. So, I mean,
I hate grubs. They are ugly.
Yep, but you're talking several times bigger than what that bean leaf beetle larvae would be, and probably what, 2-3 times the size when you look at beetle versus beetle?
Yeah, they're really big, and they've got that hard outer shell. It's a little different thing than bean leaf beetles. They're going to be a lot tougher to control, and also they can do more damage in your fields if you have them.
Yeah, but it's really kind of a similar thing to bean leaf beetles. We don't worry so much about the leaf feeding because some defoliation doesn't usually impact yield that much. It's more the pod clipping, it's more the disease getting into the plant, that type of thing. But let's talk about control. What are you going to use and what rate are you going to have to use for bean leaf beetle versus Japanese beetle?
All right, well, if we're talking about controlling either one in the adult stage when they're adult beetles, typically the pyrethroid chemicals are the cheapest and pretty effective products to use.
Well, when you talk about control, the product that we've used on our farm has been Silencer, and the rate is going to really vary between bean leaf beetles and Japanese beetles. What I'm saying is, with bean leaf beetles, you can control that with the lowest rate of just about any pyrethroid like Silencer. 1.92 ounces would be the Silencer rate. However, you need 3.84 ounces to kill Japanese beetles. big difference. You're going to have to spend at least an extra $2 to bump up from that
Oh
low
boy.
rate to the
Oh
high
boy.
rate.
Well, okay, here's the other question though, because we get this a lot with bean leaf beetles. Yeah, I can kill them with that low rate, but what do you think about residual? Do I need to have residual
Yeah,
out
the
there?
residual isn't that big a deal because bean leaf beetles typically don't move from field to field. They can to some degree, but it's not like soybean aphids where they're going to fly in from miles away. They might just move from one field right to the next one, but for the most part, they're in your field from last year. They're here again this year. So really where you could start is with a good seed treatment. If you had Cruiser Max, Innovate, Trilix 6000, or even Acceleron, all those should wipe out your bean leaf beetles early. They probably won't be great on Japanese beetles, but at least they'll hold the Japanese beetles back.
Well, and again, if you can just wipe out these bugs when they're in that adult stage, you won't have to deal with their larvae stage feeding on your roots.
Yeah,
that
for
ends
the
up being a
multiple
big deal.
generations and everything. And if you control your bugs this year, you should have less problem next year and that type of thing. But again, if you do see them post-emerge in your soybeans, use the low rate for bean leaf beetles, high rate for Japanese beetles. Silencer's a good product, but there are many others. Declare, Asana, Warrior, Baythroid, you name it. Just about any pyrethroid will be pretty good. You could also switch to an organophosphate like Lorsban. We prefer the pyrethroids though.
Okay, now if you have these bugs, you can certainly spray a fungicide along with it. If you see quite a bit of feeding in your field, I would strongly recommend putting in fungicide in most cases.
Yep.
Even a half rate of fungicide is enough kind of to protect those areas so you don't get diseases moving into those chewed up and open areas.
Yeah, because remember, any feeding that beetle does, whether it's the Japanese beetle or the bean leaf beetle, you're much more likely to get disease in that crop.
When you're out looking for those bugs, don't forget to keep an eye out for our Weed of the Week. Can you identify this week's weed?